So I think more wisdom, more archaeology and anthropology, and less killing is my formula for finding these things out. And also the first emperor of China, the guy that built the Great Wall and all that, they've now discovered his grave. It's in a huge pyramid complex in the middle of China. But they haven't yet gone in to dig the middle bit, because they're still a bit afraid. There might be booby traps and stuff. You know, but that will happen. We'll go in there and find out what he left. You know, we still haven't found the grave of Alexander the Great. If anyone wants to become a passionate archaeological sleuth, there's recruitment going on here, because we need to find the grave of Alexander the Great. Maybe he left his last testament. Maybe the hidden book of Aristotle on comparative religion is in there, that he took on campaigning. We don't know. I can't wait. I hope I'm alive when they find that grave, because it's probably either in Siwa or in Alexandria. You know, discuss. We know the body was brought to Egypt from Babylon, where he died, by Ptolemy, his favourite general, and was buried there. And people saw this grave, this tomb rather, it was a huge splendid thing, and wrote about it, but now it's all vanished. We don't know where it was. So anyway, there's an example of why archaeology is exciting and why we like Indiana Jones. We need to find these mysteries. And as for the lost autobiography of Jesus, I mean, that could be in some cave in the Judean desert, when he finally tells the story of what really happened. Find it in some scrolls, maybe hidden away. I'd love that. Because that's why we also need archaeologists for the paleography, ancient writings that can be found, because they shed light on human intellectual history. Okay, any questions about that one? It's exciting, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, let's just look at Hegelianism then, because that's number 143 on the box. It's another philosophical one, and I've always liked. I mean, I never studied Hegel at university because the teaching was so atrocious, and they didn't get you excited in it. There was just maybe they didn't understand. There was the dominant modality of Bristol University philosophy department was logical positivism and Wittgenstein, and they all regarded Hegel as a sort of devil figure that you had to study a bit. He was continental European, was an idealist, and therefore by definition was on the wrong team of history. And it was muttered that, you know, he was responsible for some dark stuff going on in Europe, like, you know, people that just, one didn't mention in polite society because one was an atheist and some kind of a Marxist. So anyway, no, we were not taught to take Hegel seriously at all. So then I went and did my protest, resigned from university because it was terrible, and went off and studied independently and privately in Canada for 4 years. And that's when I read Hegel for the first time, taking him out of the library of the University of Calgary and reading. And I was amazed. Like, it was like, what? Why has nobody told me about this before? I discovered that this guy was a genius. Like, way ahead of his time, way ahead of even now, most philosophers on the planet. What Hegel was trying to do, he was professor of philosophy at the University of Berlin in the early 1800s. And but he'd worked his way up. He'd been the headmaster of a school. He was a teacher like me. He self-educated. He did his degrees, and he read and read and read and read. And he mastered the sum total of philosophical knowledge. He read the whole of Plato, Aristotle, the entire Western canon. What he was looking for was how to integrate it all into one ultimate system. Instead of just, like, he'd look at the table and say, okay, great, but put it into one, he'd say, like, make it a unity, right? Find out how it's all interconnected. Trace the underground connections and then see how they're all flowing. How do they all flow into each other, according to what laws? So for that, he had to he had to master the sum total of all possible traditions, and he read far more widely than any other philosopher in his day. He studied Chinese thought, Islamic thought, Jewish thought, pagan thought. He was an omnivore. And he also studied esoteric thought. He studied the Hermetic traditions of ancient Egypt. And he studied the Kabbalah. And he studied the esoteric teachings. And Christian mysticism. Jacob Boehme, these kind of people. And he gradually worked on a synthesis. He realized he'd have to change the way we think of logic. So he had to reform what logic is. He realized he'd have to reform the way we think of history. And so he gave these lectures at the University of Berlin on the philosophy of history. And his breakthrough moment, if you want, the aha insight, was that all culture is like one giant river flowing. This really should be redrawn as a river map system, like an Amazon. This is human history, right? And each of these tributaries flow into the main ones. They follow the laws of what he called dialectic. He realized there is a law that governs all this. It's not just random. Dialectic is his name, which he borrowed from Heraclitus, one of the great philosophers of antiquity, and also Socrates, for the process whereby history moves forward. It's not random, it follows specific laws. And what is the law? So the law of dialectic is that when a thought stream here flows into the river and hits this thought stream, they intermingle. They take on the qualities and characteristics of each other, and they stream forward in a third synthesis which has elements from both sides. And this is the essence of his system of dialectics. So history is full of that process. So Christ, as a young man, studied, we know, esoteric Judaism. He knew about the books of Enoch. He knew something about ancient Egyptian wisdom. He probably studied that. He knew about Greek, certain aspects of Greek thought, Hellenism. He knew enough to talk to some Greeks about philosophy and stuff. And he put all this stuff together in his mind as a new synthesis, which was, so all these currents of rivers flow into Christ's subconscious or conscious mind, and it comes out with a new teaching, which is love your enemies. This was kind of new, even though some of the Stoics had been saying the same stuff. But the way he said it was new. Don't worry about the outer form of your religious worship. Doesn't matter what you wear or what you eat even. It's your inner piety, your prayer life that matters. And that's not a public thing. So out came what we then call Christianity from that new synthesis. We can see this operating in all the boxes. So if you were a Hegelian, as I sort of am, I would say that each of these boxes has been formed like an underground river through the synthesis of different currents. So if we went back to the history of Taoism and Confucianism in China, we'd see that Lao Tzu absorbed many, many things from classical, traditional Chinese mythology and law, but then he filtered them through his own spiritual experiences, his own meditations, and he tested them all. And he worked out the Tao as a flow, and so Confucius was influenced by that, but he brought in more his own knowledge. So I think and Hegel talks about these guys as well. So what's so interesting about Hegelianism is that it was a major attempt in the 19th century to map and analyse the living dynamic underlying human history at the spiritual level. Now, he remained a Christian. He was a theologian of sorts, and he believed that that force that does the dialectic in history is similar to what the Holy Spirit does in the life of an individual. It's when you become animated by something that affects your soul at a very deep level. Now, he wasn't the first to say that. There's a long tradition of Christian mystics who've said that, going back to Joachim of Fiore, who said that history takes three forms, three stages. We had the age of the father, which is where patriarchy ruled, the man has power. It was quite brutal, you know, if the man thinks whatever he says you've got to do, you know, quite authoritarian. The next phase is what Joachim called the age of the son. The child becomes important, the mother becomes important, the new life becomes important. So you kind of worship the baby Jesus in the manger or whatever. The child becomes the key thing. Joachim said this third age of history is the age of the Holy Spirit, which we haven't yet got, which is when, as Christ put it, we all worship in spirit and truth equally, whatever colour, race, religion, gender we are. That threefold idea of history is really inspired a lot of esoteric currents, and Hegel picked up on them. And his attempt was to give a scientific explanation for this. One of his Polish successors, so after Hegel, there's a whole bunch of very interesting characters we call Hegelians, philosophically speaking. And one of my favourites is a chap called Trzaskowski, who was Polish. And he picked up on this idea of the ages of history and the future. He wrote a book called Historiosophy. He was trying, I mean, history is great, we love it, you know, we all love history, but what's the point of history? Where's it going? Where's the future? Are we going to self-destruct in a nuclear war when Putin decides to press his nuclear toys? I mean, I hope not, because that would be against everything history is about, which is about synthesis and you know, and love ultimately. Hegel did say that what does the dialectic is love, when the opposites attract and flow into each other. So, anyway, Trzaskowski was a genius Polish intellectual who understood all this and you know, worked it out. Unfortunately, Karl Marx is the guy that stole the thunder from Hegel. And Marx was a clever chap who, left the law department to study philosophy, and he mingled and met a lot of Hegelians. He never met Hegel himself. He got to Berlin after he was dead. He never met him or heard his lectures, but he read his books intensely and believed that he saw the flaw in Hegel. Marx was one of those really arrogant students. I've met a few myself who want to steal your ideas and then change them all and repackage them and promote them as their own. It's not good policy to do that. But that's what Marx was like. He was a plagiarist, actually, who stole ideas, repackaged them and pretended he thought them up. And he did that with Hegel. The trouble with Marx's education was he had no real grounding in actual philosophy or theology. He was very limited in his knowledge. He came from a profoundly learned background. His father was a Voltairean Jewish lawyer who'd converted to Christianity. So, you know, that's quite a mixture. And had young Karl baptized, ostensibly as a Christian, but for Marx, he didn't take it at all seriously. He ignored it completely. And he jumped under the inspiration of some of the Hegelians who were impatient with Hegel, because to be a serious Hegelian requires an awful lot of study. It's like you have to master all the boxes, guys. There's no quick way, okay? And they got frustrated and said, no, I want it now. I want the Holy Spirit age immediately. Like, I don't want to know all that stuff. That's all past. Let's jump there immediately. And inspired by particularly a chap called Feuerbach, who wrote an anthropological critique of all religions. Clever chap, young Hegelian. He said the problem with all these religions is they're all creating God in the image of us humans. So God is an old man or a woman or a goddess or whatever. Whereas actually it's us projecting all this stuff onto the sky. And we have to reclaim our power. So replace all theology with anthropology. That was Feuerbach's idea. And Marx lapped it up because that meant, well, we don't have to bother with religious studies. We can just bin it, right? I don't agree with Feuerbach myself, even though he came from an illustrious family. His father was the Minister of Justice in the Bavarian court, a lawyer who introduced legality to the Bavarian system and abolished torture. Because up to that point in the Bavarian kingdom, you could torture people to get the facts, which you could in most of Europe. But gradually that was dying a death, that practice. And under the influence of Beccaria, an Italian thinker, a more humane approach to law was coming in, that you should have evidence and courts and legal procedures and not torture. So old man Feuerbach did that. I respect him for that. But his son was a bit of an extremist, in my opinion, in his rejection of all religious thought as a projection. Unfortunately, Marx drank from the Feuerbach bottle and became drunk, and he never grew out of it. He just utterly, totally rejected the whole point of Hegel, which is its Geist, or spirit, that makes the dialectic possible. Marx said, no, it's matter, purely material. It's chemistry and physics. So anyway, I don't agree with that, but one can respect, he just made a mistake. It was a category error. Fortunately, there were other great Hegelians, Bradley in Britain, T.H. Green, Lord Haldane, who was a great British Hegelian, who founded the University of London, where I graduated. Croce, the Italian intellectual philosopher. And in France here, we had a Russian called Kojève, who in Paris in the 40s and 50s taught a course of lectures on Hegel, saying, hey, we ought to look at this guy. He's quite important. And all the greatest French intellectuals went along to these lectures and studied there. And it gave French intellectual life a sort of whole boost, because it had become a bit moribund in its positivistic phase of scientism. The duty of philosophers is to shoot themselves because philosophy is useless, only science matters. That was the positivist idea. And Comte did try suicide at once. I think the thought so oppressed him, he thought, what's the point of living? He had a nervous breakdown and tried to commit suicide. Well, that's what you get if you become a positivist, so I don't think you should walk down that route. Whereas Hegel gives you a sort of silken thread of grace to hold on to. And I recommend that we haven't done with this yet, because we still need to work out how we can synthesize opposing forces into a harmony of dialectical integration. And Berlin is still now, tragically, the centre of new conflicts raging between. What's also interesting is in Russian philosophy, when I went to Moscow and met advanced Russian thinkers, there's a whole tradition of Hegelianism in Russia, among Russian intellectuals in the 19th century, that was really important. The greatest Russian philosophers were Hegelians. Lenin wasn't a proper philosopher either. And Stalin was like an anti-philosopher. What the Bolsheviks did was destroy the real philosophical depth that Russia had. and convert it into an anti-philosophical tradition, which is Bolshevism, where they shot the philosophers for being bourgeois intellectuals. Some of them escaped. Lenin wasn't completely a beast. He let some of them go into exile. And that's how Kojève got out, how he ended up in Europe. So anyway, there's lots there. It's fascinating stuff. And I've got, I don't have the complete works of Hegel, but I've got some of the key texts here in the philosophy section. Any questions?
Well, thank you very much for your enthusiasm. It's really raising so many questions. Of course.
Yeah.
A few of them is what about psychology? And another one is about emergence, when you have something new from old stuff coming out. You said, for example, you took the example of parable of Christ saying when you are hit on one side, just present the other side. I was surprised it existed already, but for example, the resurrection of the body, maybe it's something new in religion. And but most there is a word you use. I think is very important. Is integration. As the dialectic is a step forward, but you keep somewhere the memory of the two different flows because you integrate them. And it's a kind of cooking.
Yeah, like an alchemy.
Yes, I don't know how to say that, but...
Yeah, each of us is an individuation of our parents. I can feel parts of my father and my mother in me, but they're integrated in one new being.
Yeah.
Yes.
But thank you very much. It's really great.
Well, maybe we'll do psychology next week, because it's a huge topic, but I'd love to look at psychology. And the question is whether, Hegel was aware of psychology, but he was a philosopher. He didn't. We'll look at that next week. That would be interesting. I think it's time to turn to the gods.
Yes.
Because, you see, the thing is, I think Hegel would have loved this, and he didn't have access to it, because a lot of this is new stuff. Some of these new religions didn't exist. But he kind of wanted this. He tried to do a single one-man version of it in his various writings, which were voluminous. And the last thing I want to say about Hegel that I didn't actually know, because there's so much to learn, until I went to Athens to the World Congress of Philosophy. In 2013, I stayed in a flat in Athens owned by a friend of mine, her parents, and the father was a professor of sociology at the University of Athens. And he had an amazing library. And for a week, I had, the flat to myself. I was going to the conference of the World Congress of Philosophy in the day, listening to lectures about Hegel and all kinds of stuff. And then coming home in the evening and reading, right? It was a paradise in Athens, in a part of Athens where Pericles lived, the great democrat who defended Athens against the tyranny of Sparta. Anyway, he had a 2-volume set of Hegel's works on aesthetics, which I didn't know about. Nobody told me about. I'd never read these things. I didn't know they existed because I was not taught properly. And, like 1,000 pages. Hegel did a course of lectures on the history of art, aesthetics, and how art changes over time, and how art conveys the spirit of the age. And he starts with classical art, ancient Egyptian, goes right through the early, the great classics of sculpture and so on in Greek Hellenistic art, and then early Christian art, and he talks about Islamic art and stuff. So it's another way of talking about how the dialectic of spirit shifts and changes our cultural perceptions. And his aesthetics is very, very sophisticated. I don't know of a better introduction to the philosophy of art than his lectures. And yet, I mean, my daughter did a degree in art at Brighton. They never teach this stuff. So far as I know, they're not aware. I mean, I was ignorant of this. But so I just wanted to mention that as another thing in terms of art. Okay, now let's turn to the gods. Let's see what they're up to. Here, you go first. Ah, man.
Fishy, could you help me?
Okay. Yeah, we have the cat.
Elle ronronne.
Yeah. Oh, no, we had him recently. Ah, there we are. Okay, what have we got? Aha, that's interesting. So we have the page of Earth from ancient Mesopotamia, Ea.
Ah.
And given we were talking about Mesopotamia and Sumerian stuff, that's quite appropriate. Because he is, from that culture. So let's see what he's got to say for us. I think it's a sign. We're on the right path.
Yeah, you pressed it, I think. No?
No, it's coming up. Here it is. Voila. So Ea is the god of wisdom in ancient Mesopotamia. So we need wisdom, don't we, to get through these problems the Earth is facing at the moment. In Sumerian language, he was called Enki, and Ea was his name in the Semitic Akkadian language of Babylon and Akkad. The Sumerians said he was the god of knowledge, crafts, and creation. And he's one of the council of the gods, the Anunnaki. They're the wisdom gods that create the whole of society and the earth. It's speculated he might be identified with Yah in Canaanite religion, which might be an origin of Yahweh. So it's possible, you see, some of what Yah does is similar to what Yahweh does. So just bear that in mind. David Roll, who's a kind of Indiana Jones of the archaeology of the gods, he reckons that they're connected. What we do know, he was the patron god of the city of Eridu in Mesopotamia, in Sumeria. His cult spread throughout Mesopotamia and as far as the Canaanites or Palestinians, Hittites, Hurrians, and Hebrews. He was associated with a southern band of constellations called the Stars of Ea, which is in the field of Pegasus. Interestingly, he was associated with the number 40 because these Babylonian gods were also mathematical. They had a number, which is interesting, and 40, which is an important number, was his sacred number. Archaeologists have discovered texts from various sites stretching from southern Iraq to Palestine, which mention Ea and Enki. The Sumerian Enki, Ki means the earth, and En is Lord, so Lord of the earth. Interesting role that he plays in the biblical story, because some of the early Bible was taken from Mesopotamia by when the Jews settled there as exiles from the Holy Land. They brought back the legends and stories. And it's possible that, orally they also knew some even earlier, because Abraham was from that culture. He was from Haran, which is in the north of Mesopotamia. But they would have known the stories of Ea and Enki. And what we know is that it was Ea who warns mankind in the form of a sage called Utnapishtim that a great flood is coming. And it's Ea who tells him to build an ark and save mankind. And we're all descended from Utnapishtim and his family. Now this story is much, much older than the Bible. And archaeologists, hooray, let's hear it for archaeologists, discovered the texts, right, digging up these ancient cuneiform texts. So we know that that aspect of the Bible is from these older legends. And so in a sense he stands for that, the divine that wants to help humanity survive and loves us. And that's really important, that we hold on to this. I love the Noah story. I think most children do, that we survive. And then the image of the rainbow that comes, and it's a symbol of peace for the peace movement. And so I think we should all listen to Ea and learn how we can survive. Yes, there's lots more in the text here. I won't read it all out because it would take all night. But one great expert, Samuel Noah Kramer, was an expert on Enki, or Ea. And there's a wonderful story about Ea. I'll read this out, which has been found. Because Ea is also the Lord of language. And given I'm doing this book on the 99 Names of Peace, he's like my line manager. Okay, this is the story that's come down. Once upon a time, there was no snake. There was no scorpion. There was no hyena. There was no lion. There was no wild dog, nor wolf. There was no fear, nor terror. Man had no rival. In those days, the lands of Subur and Hamazi, harmony-tongued Sumer, the great land of the decrees of princeship, Uri, the land having all that is appropriate, the land of Martu, resting in security, the whole universe, the people in unison. To Enlil, in one tongue, spoke. Then Enki, the Lord of abundance and the true word, the Lord of wisdom who watches over the land, the leader of the gods, endowed with wisdom, the Lord of Eridu, changed the speech in their mouths, brought contention into it, into the speech of man, that until then had been one. Okay, it's the origin of the Babel story here, and it's older than the Bible story of Babel. Now, there's only a fragment's been discovered. We don't know why Ea did that. Okay. Is it a case of divine Sophiophobia, where the gods are afraid of humans becoming too wise, and so they have to kind of damp us down and make us stupid? Or we might get to heaven, discuss. I mean, or to go back to the anthropological critique of Feuerbach, is all that just a